Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Joseph Anselmi. I am the AP Capstone research teacher from Klein Cain ISD. Now, this video is actually going to be up on our website, which is available to all Klein ISD students. So you might be coming at us from any one of the 5 high schools. But today, we're going to be talking about discipline-specific research, which is kind of what does research look like in different fields and different disciplines. This conversation is going to be between myself and my brother. This is my brother, Thomas Anselmi. Say hi to the people, Thomas. All 7 that are going to watch this video. We are 2 different sides of research. So myself, I have a master's degree in history with an emphasis on ancient Rome and Greece. And Thomas, I'll let you introduce yourself.
So my name is Thomas Anselmi. I am the director of analytics and data science for a major insurance carrier. And I do not have a master's degree in history.
No. Well, and that's actually kind of the point of the conversation is research is not reserved for academia, right? Now, my first question is how did you get into the role that you have? So even though I'm a teacher, I'm going to talk about how did I get into the role of a master's student and what did that look like? But I'd like to hear from you first. How did you get into the role of analytics and data science? Did you major in that? What did you do to get there?
So it's actually a very roundabout story. I actually found out that I was good at data analytics and seeing what the story of data analytics was.
But can you explain real quick? Can I interject? A lot of our students won't know. When you say you found out you were good at data analytics, what is data analytics that you're good at?
That is being able to take a body of data, whatever that may be. That can be, and data can be encoded in sound. It can be encoded in video. It can be encoded in imaging, or it can just be regular text, numerical or alphanumeric. And being able to glean something from that, being able to pull information from that, being able to come to actionable conclusions after data analysis, after you discover a pattern, after you rearrange that data in a way that makes sense for whatever question you're trying to ask, that sort of thing. I mean,
okay.
So data analytics is a very large field, and so it's not hyper specific to a certain industry or even to a certain technique.
Okay, cool. So that's a great answer. So anyway, you were saying you realized you were good at data analytics, and I kind of interrupted.
Yeah, so I actually realized I was good at it through amateur auto racing. There are extremely sophisticated data collection tools for whenever someone is taking laps around a particular track or circuit that look at everything from the different G-forces on your car, the different tire pressures, your steering angle in relation to your actual movement angle, your brake position, your gas position, and things like that. And I would, I guess, more easily than others, be able to squeeze out little changes that a driver could make in order to save quite a bit of time on the track.
I mean, is this something you were doing? Were you driving as a hobby? Or were you helping others?
So some, but I have always just loved auto racing, and I actually was better at the analysis side than even the driver's side. I was just very mediocre.
Didn't even know that.
And typically what I would do is ask so the major companies that make these, that they actually give the software extremely sophisticated software, but they give it away because they are always looking for, to lower the bar of entry for people who want to get into this sort of thing. And so what I would do is just ask other people for a record of their track when they were kind of fast, and then I could cobble together kind of what an optimum sort of lap would look like, and then look at someone else's data and say, okay, look, you're braking at the right spot as someone who is very fast here, but you're not actually reaching peak brake power as quickly as someone else. So what you're doing is you're giving up, 50 extra feet when that could be turned into acceleration.
That's really cool. How did you parlay that into insurance?
So what's actually kind of interesting is that it's not terribly different. What you're looking for is pattern. You're looking for story. You're looking for action, right? So whenever you find a piece of actionable intelligence, right? Like I just said, why is someone not able to slow their car down, make a turn, and then accelerate out of a corner as fast as someone else, right? That can be for any number of reasons, any number of inputs that they're doing that are incorrect, right? And the same thing can happen for loss or for risk or for anything else. Why is every time we engage in a certain market segment, we are not as profitable as maybe a competitor or maybe someone else? That could be due to our risk selection. That could be due to how we rate these risks, which portion of the risk that we find the most dangerous, and so therefore should charge a certain amount of premium for, or which parts are causing us to have to pay greater than expected losses. All of those things eat into profitability. That includes the flip side is, the number one way in insurance to avoid having to pay for any losses is to take on no risk.
Right.
But that's obviously not how you run a business.
Right.
You want to aggressively go after safe risks, but you cannot be aggressive if you don't know where the tops and bottoms are, where your limits are. So again, it's not different at all from race car driving in that sense, where if you have more grip to give, then you can be more aggressive.
Yeah.
And if you're more aggressive, you can brake harder, brake faster, turn in harder, accelerate out faster. All of that will add up to half a tenth or a tenth of a second. And that's a massive advantage that, just like with lots of things in business, you actually carry that forward. So if you are to give yourself half of a tenth of a second advantage on every corner, and there's 20 corners in a lap, you will find yourself exceptionally ahead of the competition, even though each one of those corners seems almost negligible.
Right. No, so that's super interesting. So I'll answer the question for myself, right? I had a much more traditional introduction to research. So to achieve a master's degree in history, most students complete a thesis project, a thesis work, a master's thesis, which typically in the field of research, in the field of history, what you're trying to do is advance historical conversation, right? Or offer new understanding to texts or information, or examine a text that hasn't been examined before. And so when you're working on your PhD, your doctorate, you put forward a doctoral dissertation. For most students, their master's thesis is typically the first 50 to 100 pages of what will become their PhD. For me, however, I was studying ancient history at Texas Tech. And that field is so broad, right? To advance the conversation in history, most of my friends at Tech were studying World War II, were studying Vietnam War, which Texas Tech has the premier school in the Vietnam history in the country, actually even in the world. And so these friends of mine who were all in my cohort, they were examining 2 years, 3 years of historical history, right, within one region of one country or one conflict or whatever. And from there, they could really pour into it. For me, I'm examining all of ancient Rome, right, plus all of ancient Greece, plus most of the Near East, right, parts of Persia, Anatolia, and places like that. So for me, what I did was actually a portfolio of work of, I think I ended up writing about 130 pages, but it was over a variety of subjects to introduce me to different fields of historical research. And so I did some original research, but most of my master's was kind of teaching me the craft of different types of historical research so that if I were to go on to get a PhD, um, I would I would have a lot of tools in my belt, as it were, and a lot of breadth of knowledge to where I could then dive in wherever I wanted. So for me, it was a portfolio, but for most, it's a thesis. So that's kind of how it works here. So the next question I had was, what's your current or some recent research? I know, obviously you have to keep, I'm sure, a certain amount of confidentiality, but whatever details you can give, what does research look like in current or recent projects or a specific project that you're on right now?
So, a lot of them start out following some similar patterns. A very popular pattern that I like to engage in, especially in the business world, especially in well-established businesses. Like insurance, which has been around for 400 plus years.
The Romans had it, just so you know.
Our modern form of it.
I know. I'm just playing.
British Maritime. And what I love about working in that sector in the commercial side is you have a tremendous amount of knowledge that gets passed down, but you haven't codified all of that knowledge. There's a lot of people who are right about things because they consistently are correct. They take in a lot of information, they make some assumptions, they turn that into some sort of business action, and then more often than not, they're correct. And they have successful careers. What I really like to do is take an opportunity to find out, okay, let's start from the premise for a moment, okay, that someone makes some observation or something that is just an everyday sort of observation for them, just something that they come across all the time. I then take and put data to that, right? So one of my current projects is just taking a few additional points of data that have always kind of been involved in the risk selection and rate making process with regards to commercial automobiles, and then applying kind of more sophisticated and modern techniques in order to really distill out from these pieces of data which parts of these data are most likely responsible for providing the insight and the predictability that a lot of experienced insurers have always kind of known would be there.
Okay, so if I can sum that up, what you're kind of saying is you apply data to what is otherwise has relied on business instinct or general skill.
Yeah, well, the data's always been there.
Yeah.
I apply a different. It's almost like a different subatomical look to something that was always kind of more well understood.
Okay.
Even sometimes to the exact same data. Data often that is collected not for the sake of analysis for what I use it for, but just for the sake of in the process of doing their day-to-day business. They needed to collect these data in order to do the business, and then I come behind and say, hey, wait a second. There's actually even more value from this data that we've been collecting for a decade.
I see.
That can give additional insight.
So
It's not like in the historical sense, you're taking a writing or something that it's always been there.
Right.
Right, but maybe you're synergizing it with something else, and then all of a sudden it's now in a context where it just gives, slightly new meaning.
Right. No, that's exactly what's going on. So, like in a historical setting, so I'll talk because I'm not doing research anymore now that I teach high school. Really, right? That's not a part of a high school teacher's job, is to contribute to research. So I'll talk about some of the projects that I was doing in my graduate studies. And history names their fields of research like a lot of places do. But I was getting taught things like different tools of history. So historiography, which is the examination of how history was written. So exactly like what you're saying, right? So the German school of thought that led historical research in the 1800s, well, it was good, but then it's also missing this or has this application or from the German culture is applying this or that and where, your understanding. And then the schools of thought move on, right, to Marxist historical thought or introducing cultural theory into historical thought, right? So that's historiography. We did a lot of comparative literary analysis, right? So especially my professor, so Dr. Gary Forsyth, who I worked with really hand in hand for a number of years. He's one of the foremost historians in ancient Roman history, but specifically early ancient Roman history. There's about 6 professors who focus on the kingship of Rome, right? The kingship is from 753 to 509 BCE, an incredibly old period of time. And there's basically only 2 ways to go about history back then, that far back. Is archaeological, which he did some, but he would do comparative literary analysis, looking at not only history, but myth and legend and story and all of these other things and comparing all of them and seeing where they can corroborate each other, where they conflict, and exactly kind of what you're saying, taking things that already exist and squeezing new insight out of them. We did things like numismatics, which is the study of coins, right? Exactly what you're saying here. This is kind of cool. I've never thought about it this way, but exactly what you're saying here, right? No one in history is making a coin so that 500 years later I can learn something about their coin. They're making a coin as currency. It's solving a problem. But to historians, what you put on your coins is it's a mark of a lot of things. Usually there are dates that are specific that we can get some of our most specific ancient dates off of coins. Similarly, epigraphy. Epigraphy is the study of inscriptions. I spent almost an entire paper, right, writing on my primary sources for that paper were tombstones and a shard of pottery about this big. I mean, those were my primary sources because tombstones are some of the most honest people ever get, right? It tells a lot to future about what do people think about marriage or what do people think about childhood or family, right? The way they're honoring their dead tells a lot about their culture. And then my biggest project that I did in research was what's called prosopography. And prosopography is the examination of a family through history, which was one of the most interesting things I ever did. The project that probably would have become my dissertation had I stayed on and pursued a PhD. The new research I had done was on a family called the Claudii Marcelli, and they have a specifically interesting, unique place in history. They had three consuls, and I know you know these terms. I'll explain them to people watching. Right, the head of the Roman Senate was a consul, and there were two of them, similar to what our role of president is. We had two; they were co-consuls. The Claudii Marcelli, they had a consul in Rome in 51, in 50, and in 49. 3 successive years had one of these guys. Two of them were brothers, one of them was a cousin. But that means this family had a front row seat. And Thomas, I know you know your Roman history. They had a front row seat to the decline of Rome into its civil war between Caesar and Pompey. And somehow this family actually makes it through all of the killings and all of the death that happened in that civil war, all of the bitterness, all of this, to where actually Emperor Tiberius, Caesar Tiberius, is a Claudii Marcelli. And they were staunch opponents to Caesar and the entire Principate system. So it was really interesting to see this family shift and change and have this front row seat. And so you got to study them that way. So those were kind of my projects that I was doing. I did a lot on the cult of Dionysus and a lot of early Roman religion. But then my prosopographical study was probably the biggest project I had in college.
So what's interesting that you're saying is the thoughts that I'm having when you're talking about, the coin history, even the tombstones and things like that is, historians are very often talking about the what it is, what's on the coin, that sort of thing. If I were to ingest the data that's on a coin, right, in some way, and I preserved the image or the form of the coin, what on the data science side, these algorithms are automatically going to pick up is also the how it was put on the coin.
But I want to
maker's marks, certain tooling marks, things like that.
See, I want to make a note though. Sure, I want to make a note though. You make a distinction, but I think there's an important distinction to make. So, archaeologists are the most interested in the what. Historians, and this is why I prefer history to archaeology, historians are more interested in the why. So why that person? Why is Alexander the Great? Why does he have a lion's mane on his head? Well, because he's hearkening back to Heracles, right? Well, why does that matter? Well, why does that matter, right? Our big question, and that's what separates archaeologists, get so frustrated with historians because we're always trying to go that one step further and go, yeah, but why is it there? But why do we do that?
Well,
whereas the archaeologists are doing the work.
What I'm saying is interesting about data science is it's also very interested in the how.
Yeah, that's really fascinating.
How did he get a lion's head? Because the fact that he did, right? The what?
Right.
You're saying that's archaeology. But
more or
less. Do that, right? Is the historical point of view.
Right.
And what I'm saying is the how he did it. When you synthesize all of the data that you can, those are the sorts of things that start revealing themselves. The how is, all of a sudden you're able to say, well, I know he did not physically go to the native area of that lion, but because of all this other data, I now know that lion came to him in some way, or, a special trip was made, a special gift. And you make these very short, you greatly shorten the assumption gaps that you have to jump because you're able to, with modern machine learning and things like that, just synthesize massive amounts of data where all of a sudden the story seems extremely clear.
That's really cool.
What they put on a coin and why they put it on a coin, I find can often be extremely related to how they put it on a coin.
Yeah.
A new technique is exactly why they decided to put something, on there that they couldn't put on before.
Yeah. Yeah. And thinking through it, I mean, as a historian, the how is important. It would be something of interest if we had it, especially in the ancient world, it gets really tough to get that kind of data. But that's super fascinating to think through it as archaeological versus data versus historical.
Well, and these disparate data points, they just become less disparate in a modern data science world.
Yeah.
You have focused historians, focused archaeologists that can spend their entire careers doing things, and it's very difficult to jump completely off the shoulders of all archaeology or all history,
right?
Because it's almost too much to take in,
right?
And that's where my field of modern analytics really helps.
Well, you kind of answered my next question. I'll answer it for myself, though. I asked you, how do you develop a research question? But you kind of answered that. You go through what is taken as what is.
That's one of the ways,
right?
I always like to say, I don't know, for some reason I attribute this to Bill Gates, but I don't even know if that's true. The quote that success is a menace because it makes otherwise smart people think they can't fail. I love looking in places of success because no one thinks to look there anymore.
Right.
Once someone has, for instance, if a business is successful and they have a database that has helped them be successful, a customer database or whatever it is that they have to have in order to run their business. That's the reason why they did it. Most people don't look at that business anymore because why would you? They're already successful.
Well, and especially from a business world, if it's not on fire, it doesn't have my attention.
Well, and that's the thing is, where do you find, because there's different reasons to do research. In my world, I do research because I am looking for competitive advantage.
Right.
So that means that I can't just research things that haven't been researched before.
Right.
You may have more of an opportunity to do that in academia, or at least a portion that hasn't been researched before, or something like that. Business has iterated very, very, very quickly. There is not a lot that hasn't been touched somehow, some way.
Right.
What I find is there's a great deal that have only been touched in one way.
Right.
There's a lot of data that's only been looked at once for the purpose that it was originally collected for, or whatever. Not many people have gone back and gone, this is a 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional, 5-dimensional data set. What does it look like when we examine these other dimensions in the context of what we're trying to achieve?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And so for historians, it's one of those things that what you really have to be doing is participating in the general conversation of history. So you got to be reading. I mean, history really is so much getting written in academic journals and getting talked about, and it's refuting what's currently out there or examining something in a way that somebody hasn't done before. For myself, right, deciding on that project was sitting down with my professor. He knew my interests. He knew that my greatest interest out of all of those fields of Greece, Rome, in the Near East was specifically first century BC Rome, really the changeover from republic to principate. I just found fascinating. And talk about a field that has been...
That's when it gets the most fun.
Oh, gosh, it's so interesting. Well, honestly, as far as I'm concerned, it gets super interesting about 100 years prior, right? Starting with the Gracchi brother. Anyway, don't worry about it. But yeah, like it's so fascinating, right? Because yeah, I mean, it's death and mayhem and it's crazy stuff. But it's a field that is very researched. And so if you want to put a new spin on it, or if you want to examine it in a way that nobody else has, you got to find a lens. And so I'll lead into our next question, right? So what we would do, the question that I wanted to ask you next, and I'll take it first, is how did you gather data for that question? So after talking to my professor, because he knew what my field of interest was, so he sat with me and we talked and we're figuring it out. And he goes, I'd love to see a paper on the Claudia Marcelli. Like he wanted it for himself because it was they're a kind of a footnote in history. They're not, they're not the major players. They just kind of had this front row seat. And I'd like to see an academic research paper on them. Joe, you do that, and so that was part of where it came from. But my first step, right, is I go to the library, right, and not just mine, but I mean, I didn't know this until college how much libraries will gather from other libraries. I was getting primary and secondary sources. Usually, when I started a paper, I would go to the library and pull about 80 books, um, and sit down and go through hand go through table of contents and indices, um, and start looking for reference, and then go to those pages and see, is there something of note here, and I'd sticky tab it, right, with a post-it note, and just post-it note them up. And I would walk out with I've brought a laundry basket to the library. I've brought actual rolling luggage to the library. That was one of my better ideas. That was when I got to second year grad school. I bought a full, I was married, so I had gotten this nice luggage set. I just rolled that sucker in there, loaded it up, and rolled it out. It was the most brilliant I ever felt, right? And so you then take from those 80 books, you get about 30 or 40. And then you go home and you start building on a page, right? What am I seeing from source material? And so, like, sometimes it's an awesome source. So one of the ones that I used was the Magistrates of the Roman Republic, which is this great secondary source that compiled every role of every person in all of Roman history. Right? If you served as an aedile or a quaestor or whatever in whatever year in Hispania, right? In 48, your name is in there. Right. And so that was a great place to start to see where do these guys build their careers? How do they start and how do they grow? If I had had the means, I would have gone into an archive, which I didn't have the means to travel to Europe to go to an archive. But a lot of research students, a lot of historical students will go to archives where actual primary sources are kept, right? Where you're looking not at a copy of a book, but at the original text. And I had friends go to the Vatican. I had friends go to Vietnam. I had friends go to all sorts of places. And, you're wearing white gloves and you get an hour with a box and that's it all day, right? And you have to handle it carefully. So that's what it can look like to compile research on our end. What does it look like to compile research from data science?
I'm reminded of actually a very recent project that I was just doing. I was going through with one of our actuaries some of my methods, and it's not terribly dissimilar. I said, look, I don't sit around and pretend that I'm going to be the guy that's going to have the most original idea in the history of ever, right? So I start with looking at, has anyone else done something similar to what we're looking at? And so what we were looking at specifically recently was social inflation in regards to indemnity rulings in a court. Basically, what that means is if there is some incident now, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, okay, let's just say everything else is the same, right? Is a jury awarding greater claims to the claimant than they used to?
Right.
So that's that social inflation.
Sure.
And that can be hard to pin down. Is that actually happening, or these high severity awards the result of something else, right? There's a lot of reasons for it. So what did I do? Well, I went to one of the main bodies of actuarial science for casualty insurance, and lo and behold, someone had recently published a white paper on this very subject. They're extremely similar, so that instantly provided a template.
I need to interject here. So I want to hear more, but because I know the field of our class, I want to specifically talk about something real quick because these are my research students. Part of their paper, Thomas, is a literature review. That is actual, like from College Board, they have to submit a literature review. What you and I have both just described, and I want to make sure students hear this, this is a literature review, right? When I go and I look at 80 other sources, I'm looking at what does the field have to say on this current topic? What is the current understanding? When you're examining white papers from people, what you're doing is you're looking at what is the state of research within this field. That right there is your literature review that you're doing. That's its purpose. Because without doing that, you might be doing work that somebody else has already done, right? So go ahead.
It's not just that, but even in business, these things have to be defensible. You
Sure.
have to say, I've come to this conclusion because of these things.
Right.
And guess what? The literature review, to call it that, which is perfectly fine because that's exactly what it is, works both ways. I could find literature that goes, man, that in no way applies to us.
Right.
In fact, if anything, what they've done is shown that there's little reason to believe that the social inflation things exist.
Right.
Here's what they did. I duplicated their study within our own context of data and shown that it's inconclusive. The error rate on the models are far too high. So we need to proceed in a way that does not include assuming this condition.
It can open the door to the conversation. Yeah. It can provide a space for you to discuss, right? It's a place for you to attack if you need to, or defend, or corroborate, or whatever.
Well,
but
either way, it's defensible because what happens is, so if we were to say, okay, we are not going to take this into account, okay, when we make our projections, and someone goes, I need to know why you're not going to take this into account, right? Then it's because of the literature, that literary review, that we can say, well, look, very clearly, we are under these set of conditions. This piece of literature also had similar conditions and shows that there's no statistical reason to bring it into account.
Right?
Or vice versa. It doesn't really matter. You see, I'm completely agnostic, usually, to whether I get positive conclusions or negative conclusions so far in my research, because what it's done is it's provided conclusion.
Right. Oh my gosh, I'm so happy you said that. It's something I tell my students every year is negative conclusion is not bad research.
No, in fact, what it does is it saves time. I can't tell you how many times I've had an underwriter say, hey, traditionally we take this into account. Well, I did a study on that. I cannot find statistical reason that we should continue to take that into account. In fact, since that's another data point that you normally have to go and get, I would save all the time that you normally spend dealing with that and just not. Because I do not think it provides value. Here's why. And so forth and so on. And guess what? People are happy when they no longer have to do something that they traditionally had done, but because of a negative result, they no longer have to do.
Right.
In itself, again, you don't have to move the earth in order to make a tangible difference. And to put this in silly context, if every single part of your home were instantaneously moved 1 centimeter or 2 centimeters the direction, okay, that would screw up a lot of things in your house.
All of your wiring, all of your plumbing, everything.
And that is a very, very small thing.
Infinitesimal movement. Yeah, no, that's a good analogy.
Massive difference. And it's just like I was saying with the laps, every corner. If you can get 5/100ths of a second, which is just, you put two vehicles side by side and you make one 5/100ths slower than another. It's just...
It's not even noticeable.
You're not going to notice it. But you continue to do that, and it becomes a big deal. So in business, I'm never looking for the big, gigantic alley-oop slam dunk. I'm looking for the small moves that just make a difference. A very practical example is we use these supplemental applications, which are just extra questions that you ask someone who's looking for insurance, a business looking for insurance. I obtained a body of data that let me see how lots of people answered these exact same questions, right? And what I did was, where did I get responses to questions? And these weren't even uninsured. These were just other people in the same, they were in the same business as our insured, but they weren't necessarily our insured.
Right.
Not even in support, because that's not what's important.
Right.
What is, when we ask them question A, okay, and over 99% answer the exact same way, then how it becomes a useless question.
Right.
Because there is no variance. Everyone answers the same. So it doesn't matter. It does that.
It doesn't allow you to differentiate people.
Would you rather eat ice cream or arsenic? Guess what? Everyone chooses ice cream. Okay, and the 0.1% who doesn't, you're not worried about those anyway.
They're outliers in the first place.
If you were trying to find out someone's dietary interest, you would never ask that question. It actually becomes useless.
Right.
And so what we were able to do is take half a dozen questions on our supplemental application that make sense. Like, well, wait a second, wouldn't you want to know if someone chooses arsenic over ice cream? I mean, ultimately, prima facie, that's good to know.
Right.
But everyone answers similarly. You no longer need to ask it. We then slim down our supplemental application, and guess what? Is it easier to do business with someone that has a shorter app process, or
Absolutely.
one that has a longer app process?
Absolutely, shorter. Right.
Even if it's just 6 questions shorter or 10 questions shorter.
Right.
Right? It's easier. And if it's easier to do business with us, we're going to get more business.
Right.
Plain and simple. And maybe that's not the coolest, greatest, awesomest thing in the world, but the point is that when people get used to doing something, when people say, this is what we do and this is how we do it, it's hard to change that. But when you come at them with conclusive data and say, this is why we should change it, and here's the benefits, it's like, okay, of course. Why didn't we do this before? That analysis took me almost no time.
Right.
It took almost no time. It was so easy. It jumped out at me right away. One of the very first things I did when I saw the data set, and it made me go, wait a second. Why the heck are we even making people use the keystrokes or pen strokes to do it? It makes no sense.
Right. So,
we made a change.
So in the world of methodology then, and again, this is to specify to my students, right? You live in the quantitative field, right? You are doing quantitative research. You are almost exclusively living in, now you might have qualitative aspects to it in that you're looking at some survey questions, but what you're mostly doing is looking at percentages of those answers, right? And examining large data sets and drawing conclusions from it.
I am often, yes. That is true. I work a lot in the qualitative, but it is in order to be able to express it in quantitative form.
Whereas I'm in the exact flip-flop. In the historical fields, I might actually look at very relevant quantitative data, right? I'm going to look at population graphs. I'm going to look at population charts or morbidity rates of a certain time period or era, right? I'm going to take into account a lot of numbers and a lot of quantitative data, but where I'm going to mostly live is qualitative, right? I'm looking at that gets back
to the why.
Exactly. The why question puts me more into a
spike in population. Why did that happen? And you find out, well, they completed an aqueduct.
Right. Or they got a food surplus. And you're like, wait, what? Food surplus means yeah, absolutely. Food surplus means babies, right? And so you might go how, but I'm going to go why. And we're going to look. I look at quantitative data, but I live more in a qualitative field, whereas you're looking at qualitative data, but you live more in a quantitative field.
Well, yeah, because what happens is that I will see the baby boom, and then need to say how that came about.
Right. Right. What were the machinations in place to make it all happen? So we'll just do two more questions. So you talked about the conclusions, right? How are you drawing conclusions from these data sets? And now you just explained it on slam dunk conclusions, right? The 99% ice cream versus arsenic. Now that's a pretty easy way to draw a conclusion, right? That's a very evident one. When your research gets a little stickier, how are you drawing conclusions from data sets?
So in my world, especially, you don't find out you're right or wrong until after quite some time and quite a bit of action has been taken on these conclusions. So, there is a bit of, there's a balance act of, sometimes it takes courage and fortitude to say, I believe in this. And sometimes you've got to know when to say, I can't stand by this enough to say that we need to take these actions right now. And I use a lot of it has to come down to there's mathematical values that you use when you're looking at a model, when you simulate. When you come up with a model that you think expresses what you believe is happening from the data, and then you test it. There are a number of measurements that you can look to. There's almost nothing that is this is right, this is wrong, and you spend a great deal of your time checking the assumptions on which you built this model. Conclusion is, I don't want to say it's not the goal because you kind of have to do that, but let me just say this. I spend more work on anything that appears conclusive, very clearly evident, than I do on things that are inconclusive. And a lot of it has to do with, especially a too good to be true style conclusion, where all of a sudden I now have to go, wait a second, what was every assumption that I made when I assembled this data set, when I parsed it, when I put this stuff together, when I chose the algorithm to use, the methodology. Just like I was saying, these little tiny things can add up to noticeable change, like your house moving. These little tiny things that you do, these biases that you do, can very easily accumulate into something that gives you strong false positives or false negatives, and things like that. So, I pragmatically become finished with something, but I could spend quite a bit more time on almost every project I've ever done, because, it's that balance between I feel confident enough, right, that if an otherwise uninformed but intelligent person were to view everything that I've done to get to this point, that it's reasonable for me to conclude to take these actions. That's almost what I'm always shooting for. And I think I think there's a balance. You have to have the courage to make certain assumptions based upon the body of evidence that you've been able to put together. You can become so timid that you never make any conclusion.
Right.
And that's useless.
Right.
But you can also be so arrogant that you instantly draw a conclusion. And it's a tough balance. And when I mentor other data scientists, especially in the insurance field, and one of the things that I usually have to talk them into is trusting what they're finding. Develop a method and trust that method. How do you make sure your biases are in check?
Man, it's so fascinating to hear you say all of it, because I was smiling through the whole way you were talking, because when I wrote this question and I went to answer it myself, I started struggling the exact same way, going, actually, especially as a master, the conclusions I'm drawing are so small. They're such small steps, and that balancing act it's the exact same in the historical field. There are historians that are noted for their arrogance in their presentation of their stuff, and then there are historians who by the time you finish reading their work, you go, why did you even write this? You literally said nothing, right? You were so timid, you never took the shot. And so it's so fascinating.
Piece of music that is all crescendo and over.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Man, that was entirely derivative. Or, oh my gosh, that was so atonal that I can't even listen to it. Right. And you gotta find, I mean, it's so cool to hear that in data science or in history, right? The big thing that we're looking to do, and the phrase that we use over and over in history, is make the sources talk to each other. Right. And that the last voice that the reader should hear is yours. Right. The first voices that the reader should hear are the other sources throughout history. When you're putting them and it's about, how do I juxtapose this, German historian from the 1800s to this modern historian from the 20th century, right? And how do I put their two works together, all in examining this primary source from 500 CE, right? And it's only after you take the reader step by step by step by step and look at source and source and source, where you as the historian finally go, did you see what I did? Right? Did you see? And
that's the thing about conclusions too is, I don't, it's funny you say that. I don't like the term conclusion because it's a terminal condition.
Yeah.
What I do is look, everything has an aspect of selling. Okay. And that's excelling. You want to sell excitement to your students on a subject, right?
Yeah.
And getting people excited about even a boring subject is possible when you use data, you use research, you use what you do, and I look for non-terminal conditions. What I look for is, can I bring people to a place where they get to ask a question they never got to ask before?
That's exactly the same.
And you see people get excited. People will just last month. There's this woman that I'm mentoring, and we meet once a month or once a quarter, depending on what's going on a lot of her work. And she does excellent work. She really does. And it takes she thinks my input is unbelievable because all I do is say, what'd be interesting is if you change this one little thing,
right?
It begs this other question.
Right.
You did 99% of everything. Change this one thing and then force the person adjusting this. It's going to beg a question for it. It's going to demand them to respond in a way that, that is exciting. And now they're going to think you're brilliant because you made them go, oh my gosh, I can't not address this.
Right.
What you showed me conclusively forces this condition where I now need, if there's a question there and it's so strong and I'm passionate about it, I have to answer it.
Well,
and if I don't, I'm wrong.
And
you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. No, and that
history book does a similar thing.
And that leads exactly into the last question, and I'm going to answer, right, and I'll answer first, because it addresses exactly what I wanted to say. So my students often misinterpret the word conclusion, which is, again, another part of their AP Capstone paper, right? They misinterpret that as proof, right, that I've proven this beyond a shadow of a doubt. When in actuality, right, because my last question for us is, what do you think students should know about your style of research? And what I always want to tell students, because I teach history as well, I teach AP World History and AP European History. And what I want to tell them is that history is not the who, the what, the when, and the where, right? Those are literally the ABCs. So if all you ever had in history class is names, dates, and places, you missed history, right? You learned the alphabet when you should have been learning sentences. And so what history is a dialogue among academics about why are we where we are. All your conclusion has to do is continue the conversation, right? Continue the conversation in a reasonable and defensible way. Doesn't have to prove it. Doesn't have to close the book. In fact, most of the time you want exactly what you were saying. You want to open a new page. You want to inspire more conversation, because it is through that conversation, academic conversation, that we gain better perspective on history. And when we're taking into account not only what happened, but who wrote about what happened and why did they write about it in that way and what was influencing their style, right? And getting into the historiography and getting into the history of the history, right? And all of that leading you to go, okay, but now I can offer a new insight, right? And not to condemn the past, but to understand it. And those are the things I want people to know about my style of research, is that history is so much more than boring dead old white guys, because that's not it at all. It's so much a conversation, and that word conclusion really just means, have you gotten to a point where we can continue the conversation? So, final points. What would you hope students understand about your style of research?
So, as an aside, if someone wants a very entertaining way to see this in history, the documentary Hitler's Circle of Evil is phenomenal at that, because it starts at the end of World War One,
right?
With this pilot,
right?
And because it does a tremendous job of everything that you just said. So if someone really wants to see that in action, to high quality and from an historical perspective, that's a really awesome way to see that.
Cool.
It's through that documentary. So unpaid.
Unpaid solicitation.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's fun to see examples of that. It's one of the best Hitler documentaries I've ever seen that almost does not focus on Hitler at all.
Cool.
Which is really cool.
I'll have to check that one out.
Yeah, you'll check out. Just keep asking yourself, and it doesn't matter the field. It doesn't matter if it's history. It doesn't matter if it's data science. Einstein did this kind of thing. Is answer the simple questions to get to. I call them tier. The tier 1 and 2 questions is often exactly what you said. What's happening, and maybe the initial reason why it's happening.
Right.
Okay? But it's so easy to focus on that forever.
Right.
What is really exciting and really interesting when you get to the tier 3 and tier 4, the extended questions. It's just, to put it in another example, is the difference of, everyone in high school, right? It's very common to say, what do you want to study, or what career path do you think you want to pursue right now, right? And so someone may say, oh, I would like to go to Harvard Law School, and I want to do environmental law. Okay, that's perfectly fine. That's tier 1, tier 2 stuff. What is interesting is if you talk to, you can't answer these questions. So, what impact in the next 18 months do you expect to make as an environmental attorney now that you're in this portion of your career? Because you can't know to ask those until you've actually answered the others. And that's what's exciting. It's not exciting to hear someone say, I want to be a data scientist because I heard data science is something that you can be now, right? It's exciting to hear and to read about the things that they're able to, the questions that the good, solid questions that demand answers are a gift, right?
Yeah.
Anytime you can enable someone else whether it be my employers or something like that, or like you just said, the rest of the historical community. You're gifting that to them.
Yeah.
Hey guys, here's my research. All the things that we've talked about in this discussion until now, and you would never have more people excited that Joseph Anselmi showed up to the little history party because he came and was able to posit a question that they previously didn't get to consider.
Right.
And that is, it's the same in business. It's the same in science. It's use conclusions as stepping stones to get to more exciting questions.
Right.
Yeah. Einstein did that all the time. If this, if that, then wait a second. Does that mean this?
Right.
And that's what he developed special relativity from.
Right.
Was answering. I know the answers to questions 1 and 2, right? Now I'm at questions 3 and 4, and I think they demand to be answered, and that's an exciting thing. Just I would say, just like if you think you want to grow up to be an attorney or you want to grow up to be whatever, okay, pretend 1 and 2 are answered. Get to questions 3 and 4. That's a good way to find out if that's a career for you, if that's something you really want to do. If a research what good is a research topic? Because it sounds good, or because when you're finished with it, you now will be in a place to ask new questions you've never been able to ask before. That's exciting. That's why I can take old subjects, old data sets that have already been looked at many, many, many times over, but I have a knack, an ability, I've practiced it, whatever you want to call it, to find new questions from that data set, and that's why my employers like me.
Do you want to plug that our students should pay better attention in Algebra 2? Because I know you've spoken to me about that before. I mean, if you could give a little piece of advice.
Yes, I do math all day, every day, most days, and I suck at math. And that was completely because I applied so little effort to math. And every single time, I always joke that I should start a charity where all I do is stand outside Algebra 2 and calculus classes, and when some student raises their hand and says, "When are we ever going to use this?" I just open the door and tell the teacher I'll fill it. So you go take a break.
Yeah. So
the joke is on me. Over the last 10 years, I've redone or relearned everything I didn't pay attention to and did the bare minimum to get my C or B in the test. And guess what? Now all I do is math.
The teacher in me had to bring that one out in you because I have to answer that question all the time to students in history class, and I know the math teachers will appreciate it. All right. Well, Thomas, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. I really just want to thank you. And so hopefully, guys, this has provided some insight into 2 different disciplines. I'm going to have another video here in a little bit. I'm going to interview my friend, Dr. Zane Conrad, and he's going to give some insight on medical research as it applies differences from data science to history. So thanks so much, and have a good day.
Thanks a lot.
All right.